Hello, everyone. My name is Erin Laurie, and I'm the Executive Director of the Lake Huron Center for Coastal Conservation. Welcome to the third installment of our webinar series. Tonight's topic is invasive species on Lake Huron, a really important topic. Now, before we get started, I'd just like to take a minute to thank our generous sponsors. So this webinar series is part of our Coast Watcher Citizen Science program, and that program is supported financially by both Bruce Power and RBC. So thank you to them for making this happen. And I would also like to thank all of you for joining us tonight and for your dedication to Lake Huron's coastal issues. Hopefully you've had a chance to attend one or both of our previous webinars, but if not, the entire series is going to be posted online at the end in September. And the series does continue next week with species at risk. For those not familiar with us, the Lake Huron Center for Coastal Conservation was founded in 1998, and we're a registered charity working to protect Lake Huron through our science-based restoration, education, and research projects. And I like to say that we're a small but mighty team. There's 3 of us full-time here in the office, and we also have a really dedicated volunteer board of directors that oversee everything. We also have several technical consultants and advisors, and we often have co-op students and interns with us throughout the year. Our mission is pretty simple. It's to provide leadership and expertise in collaboration with our many partners to work towards a healthy Lake Huron coastal ecosystem. We do this through quite a number of different projects that we have going on at the center. We have, of course, our Coast Watcher Citizen Science program, where we have almost 100 volunteers out monitoring our coast weekly between May and October. And they're watching the coast for changes and letting us know what's going on. They're kind of our eyes and ears of the coast. We also have a microplastic awareness project where we've been researching the quantity and types of microplastics that are found in Lake Huron. We've been working towards getting cigarette butts off of our beaches through our Butt-Free Beach program. And we're also working on developing a regional coastal action plan for the southeastern shoreline of Lake Huron. So that's a coastal corridor between Sarnia and Tobermory. So that's going to be wrapping up this fall, and we'll have some interesting results to share later this year. So we're a pretty unique organization overall. There aren't very many out there like us, in that we get to spend 100% of every single day on Lake Huron coastal issues. And of course, one of those major issues is invasive species that we're finding along the lake and in the lake. So let's talk about what an invasive species actually is. So first of all, what's a native species? So a native species is a species that's indigenous to a region or an ecosystem, and it's there as a result of natural processes, so no human intervention. Then we also have non-native species. So this is a species that has been introduced to an area. So it's non-native, it's not indigenous to that area, and this can be brought there through intentional or unintentional human action. And so an invasive species is a non-native species. So these are plants or animals that can be introduced from other regions, but they're a little bit different from being just a regular non-native species, in that invasive species have a really aggressive tendency to spread. So they tend to spread to a degree that's believed to cause damage to either the environment, the economy, human health, or all of those things. And they are very dominant in their spread. They can displace and actually overtake our native populations. So that's why they're such a problem for our lake. So how bad is it? Well, there are over 190 aquatic invasive species that have been introduced into the Great Lakes Basin alone since 1950. And unfortunately, there's a new introduction around every 6 months into the Great Lakes. Now, there's a little fun fact. I have a few of those throughout the presentation. I don't know if this is an actual fun fact or not, but it's more of a sobering fact that the majority of all recorded extinctions on Earth that have occurred on islands include invasive species as one of the primary causes. So they are causing animals and plants to become extinct. Now, Great Lakes coastlines, they're one of the most diverse ecological features in Ontario. We have provincially or even globally rare species. We have species at risk, and threats from invasive species can negatively alter our beach ecosystems, our coastal wetlands, and our other coastal ecosystem types. And there are quite a few different invasive species that are found on Lake Huron, so I won't have time to go through them all today. But today I'm going to focus on some of the most aggressive ones. So we're calling these the big six on Lake Huron. And they are Phragmites, or European common reed. There's garlic mustard, spotted knapweed, giant hogweed, zebra mussels, and round goby. And I'll talk about a few others that we're finding as well throughout the presentation. So the first species that I'm going to talk about is a plant called Phragmites Australis. So this is a perennial grass. It's also known as European common reed, as I mentioned. And now we do have a native species of Phragmites in Ontario, but it's quite a bit different from the invasive species. Our native species doesn't grow nearly as tall, and it doesn't tend to aggressively take over ecosystems. So invasive Phragmites, on the other hand, it's actually been identified as Canada's worst invasive plant species by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. So on your screen, you should see a chart that shows some of the ways that you can differentiate between the native and invasive Phragmites. So Phragmites australis, the invasive one, it actually originates in Europe and Asia. And it was first observed in the wetlands and ditches in the St. Clair region, and that was back in the 1970s. And it spread quite quickly since then. It's now become really well established in coastal wetlands throughout Lakes Erie, Huron, and Ontario, and they're starting to find it along the shorelines of Lake Superior now as well, unfortunately. So what's so bad about it? Well, Phragmites grows very quickly. It can actually grow 4 centimeters vertically per day, which is incredible. And it grows into really dense stands. So in 1 meter square, you can actually have up to 200 stems of Phragmites. So I've tried walking through a fully grown Phragmites stand, and it's very difficult to get through. It's just so thick and dense. And it can grow up to almost 15 feet in height. It turns into a real wall, and there are no effective natural controls. So that means there aren't really any insects or animals in Ontario that eat this plant, so there's nothing that can really control it naturally. And Phragmites tends to thrive in disturbed habitat, which we have lots of in southern Ontario. Phragmites reproduces by, first of all, dispersing seeds, but it also reproduces through roots. It has a rhizome root system. And these rhizomes grow under the ground, and they grow horizontally, and they can actually grow several meters per year. So this is really rapid growth, and it's the most common method of reproduction for Phragmites, though the plants can produce thousands of seeds annually as well. And those can be dispersed through water, through the air, or by animals as well. And here's a picture of those rhizome roots that I was talking about there. So you can see how long they can grow. They're just massive. So what are some of the impacts of Phragmites? Well, first of all, it tends to outcompete native plants, and it just chokes them out. So it's allelopathic, which means it secretes a toxin from its roots into the soil that makes it really difficult for other plants to survive in the area. And it grows into such dense stands and at such a massive height that it blocks native plants from germinating. It blocks them from getting any sunlight. And those massive root systems as well, they trap nutrients and water, and they can actually change the hydrology and the way nutrients are cycling through the ecosystem. Phragmites also has some major impacts on our wildlife. So it reduces habitat for wildlife, first of all, and it doesn't provide any nutritional value to any of our native wildlife that we really know of at this time. So very few species are able to feed on it. And since it's choking out the native vegetation that's supposed to be in an area, that means there's going to be less food available for the animals in that area. And the studies have found as well that Phragmites supports fewer insects than our native beach and wetland plants. So that means, nesting birds, they have less food to feed their young, impacting their populations. And since it grows into the water in such dense stands, then you're actually losing fish habitat as well. And unfortunately, I've heard stories as well of animals becoming trapped. They get like turtles, for example, end up in these dense Phragmites stands, and they get lost or trapped in there and end up starving. So I've heard a few cases of turtle species at risk being found trapped in Phragmites stands, which is really unfortunate. And Phragmites also has major impacts on our economy, which a lot of people might not think of. So I've seen areas where the Phragmites has grown so thick and so tall that cottagers or other people aren't able to actually access the water. So they aren't able to go out and swim like they're used to. They aren't able to get their boats out into the water. So that really impacts recreational opportunities. And of course, we have that beautiful Lake Huron sunset. And with Phragmites growing 15 feet high in some cases, it obstructs people's view of the lake. And people are actually finding that their shoreline property values are decreasing when this plant takes over their beach or the wetland in front of their cottage. And once Phragmites has taken over and grown into these really thick, dense stands, it becomes very difficult to remove it. And because of that, it becomes very expensive. It can cost tens of thousands of dollars to remove a large stand of Phragmites. And some other issues that it does cause as well is Phragmites has been really growing a lot along roadways. You'll see it in ditches, along highways as well. And this means that since it grows so tall, there's reduced visibility along our roadways, so it becomes a safety hazard. And dried out Phragmites stands are also a major fire hazard, so something to be aware of. So how do we remove Phragmites? Well, that's a big question. And so controlling Phragmites before it becomes well established, before it grows into massive stands, it's going to help reduce the environmental impacts and the time and the cost to remove it. So it's important to attack it right as soon as you notice it near your property. And it's also important to know that this is going to be a long-term project. It takes many years to remove Phragmites. We've been working on some projects that have taken up to 5 years to get it removed from a site. And so when you're planning a Phragmites removal project or any type of invasive species removal project, you have to think about timing. And this is because you want to be aware of any wildlife that might be using these plants. So some wildlife might use the edges of dense Phragmites stands. We found a few birds nesting along the edges of stands. So you want to make sure that you're not doing major removal projects during nesting season. And you also want to be really careful and see if there are any other really unique plant or plant species in the area. So you want to make sure you're not going out and just cutting and removing everything. You want to make sure that you're leaving all the good vegetation and maybe some species at risk in an area. So really you want to think it through before you're removing Phragmites or any invasive plant, and you want to come up with a well thought out plan in advance so you're not negatively impacting your ecosystem. The Ministry of Natural Resources recommends that if you're going to remove Phragmites, you're probably best to use 2 or more different removal methods at the same time. That's going to be the most effective rather than just using one method alone. And you want to be frequently monitoring any progress with your removal project and constantly reassessing. So how to remove it? Well, Mowing using tools, so taking a lawnmower to it or hand cutting the stems or cutting the seeds off the top is not really effective, studies have found. And because it doesn't affect that massive root system. And it's actually been found that this type of management strategy might actually stimulate the growth of the plant and cause it to grow more. So we found what works really well is cutting it below the water line though. So we're cutting it to drown it. So if you have it in standing water, that's really the best thing you can do is cut it as close to the bottom of the water as you can. And this should be done in late July or early August. So you've still got most of the carbohydrate reserves in the upper portion of the plant. So they haven't started to move down into the roots like they will into the fall when the plant is ready to become dormant for the winter. So that's if your Phragmites is in standing water, but a lot of times we're finding it growing on dry land on beaches. So if you do have some Phragmites growing on a beach, we recommend the spading method. So this is pretty easy, especially if you have a really small patch. If you only have a few plants, it's really easy to go out and remove it this way. You just want to take a sharpened spade and you want to angle it next to the plant at about a 45-degree angle and use your leg muscles to push down very quickly on the spade. And what you're trying to do is to sever that root. So that huge rhizome root, you're trying to cut that right below the surface. So you're not digging it up. That's really important because Phragmites actually tends to thrive. It likes to be cut up into little pieces and dug up, and that causes it to spread even more. So you just want to do one quick clean cut to the root, and then you should be able to just pop that plant stalk right out of the ground. And then you want to leave the soil as undisturbed as possible. So that's really important. There are also new amphibious cutting machines out there. So these are being used on larger projects to remove Phragmites. So they've been used in the past few years. This machine has come from Europe. It's almost brand new technology, and it's really neat to see. So this machine that you're seeing on the bottom right of your screen, it's called a Truxor, and it floats in the water and cuts the Phragmites below the water line, and it can cut very massive quantities in one day. And then it bails up all the Phragmites, and it's pretty easy then to take it off to the shore. And but unfortunately, this method, since it's so new and the machinery is very expensive, this is a really expensive way to remove Phragmites. So really, again, it's best if you have a small patch to just deal with it right away before it becomes a big problem and before you have to bring in the heavy machinery to get rid of it. I just also want to mention that unfortunately at this time there's no herbicide that can legally be used on wet sites in Canada, and Phragmites of course likes to grow in wet areas. There are some chemicals that can be used on dry areas on land, and in some pretty serious infestations of Phragmites we've had to use this, but these require permits and should only be done by a licensed, experienced contractor. So we don't recommend using this method on your own. And sometimes this is used in combination with prescribed burning. So that's another way to remove Phragmites, but again, that should only be done by an authorized trained professional as well, because Phragmites can be very flammable and it can become out of control very quickly without experience. And there is one other method that some people have tried. So people have tried raking, using like beach raking equipment, or tarping the area, but this hasn't really been very effective. Phragmites is too aggressive of a plant for this to work on. And if you are tarping or raking an area of a beach, for example, you're going to be damaging other native plants as well. So it's not a recommended method for removal. So once you've removed your Phragmites, you have to figure out what you're going to do with it afterwards. So you have to be really careful in this disposal stage. You have to make sure that you're not causing it to spread even more, because if you're not careful with those cut plants, you can end up dispersing more seeds or even root fragments. And even if little tiny pieces of the root are floating away down the shoreline, it can actually spread and cause Phragmites to grow in other places. So we recommend using really thick plastic bags and bagging the Phragmites that you've cut and then allowing it to dry out in the sun for a few days. So this will then, the heat will kill all the seeds and all the roots, all the rhizomes. And once they're dead and dried, you can then burn the Phragmites. So if it's just a small patch and just a few plants, you could burn it in your campfire. But if it's a larger amount, you probably have to dispose of it at a municipal location. So we recommend if you do have a large removal project that you should probably get in touch with your municipality to find out if they have any type of disposal program for invasive species. And also, once you're done, you need to make sure that you clean your clothing, your boots, your equipment, because like I said, Phragmites can spread thousands of little seeds just with one plant. So if you have any of those stuck in your boots, you can track it into other areas. And this is really important, not just for removing Phragmites, but for removing any invasive plant species. You always want to make sure you're cleaning your equipment afterwards. So I mentioned we've had a large project that we've been working on at the Coastal Center, and this is at Brucedale Conservation Area, which is in the municipality of Kincardine, but it's just south of Port Elgin, if you're familiar with that area of the shoreline. And this is a beautiful coastal meadow marsh, and it's actually part of a provincially significant wetland complex, the McGregor Point Coastal Wetland Complex. And this area has just been completely taken over by Phragmites. It got to the point where the picture you're seeing on the screen is actually a beach area that people used to use for swimming. And as you can see, it would be very difficult to get out into the water, and to get a boat out there would be nearly impossible. And it's really impacted people's enjoyment of this area, and it's really impacted the way that coastal wetland functions as well. So we've been working for 5 years now to remove this Phragmites, and we've also been going out and trying to plant some native plants as well, hoping that those will start to come back once we remove the Phragmites, that these native plants will come back. And we've been doing, like I mentioned, the manual cutting below the water line. So that's what they're doing in the photo there. We've had to do a little bit of herbicide on the dry land using backpack sprayers. And then once we were able to bring in this amphibious cutting machine, the Truxor from Europe, we were able to make tremendous progress on this project, which you'll see on the next slide here. So this is an aerial shot of Brucedale Conservation Area. On the left is 2015, and you can see the people down below working to remove the Phragmites. They'd already removed quite a large patch there. But then 2 years later, after we were able to bring in this cutting machine, we were able to remove most of the Phragmites from the area. So now we're able to just work on maintenance, so cutting any regrowth that's come up, and a last few patches that we weren't able to get before because we had found shorebirds nesting in the patches. So we had left a couple of spots there that we're now able to remove. And it's just been amazing to see the transformation of this site. We've seen more frogs coming back into the area. We've seen more turtles and great egrets and blue herons all coming back, and some of the native plants starting to grow back in this area. So it's been incredible, a lot of work, but really incredible to see that type of progress happening at Brucedale. So we've talked about Phragmites quite a bit, so let's move on. I have another fun fact that a lot of people aren't aware, that dandelions are actually an invasive species. They came from Eurasia, and but they've been around since about the mid-1600s. So the next plant that I want to talk about is garlic mustard. So this is a biennial herb, and it's in the mustard family. So biennial means that the plant takes 2 years to complete its biological life cycle. So in the first year, the plant grows its leaves, its stems, and its roots right before it enters a period of dormancy. And garlic mustard forms a short kind of rosette in its first year. And so then the next spring, the stem begins to grow really quickly. The plant gets a lot taller, and it can grow up to 1 meter in height. And then the plant starts to flower and produce seeds. Now, garlic mustard tends to be kind of a forest plant, so it has been spotted in a lot of our coastal forests, our coastal woodlands. It really thrives because it's a shade-tolerant plant, so it thrives in shady upland forests and along wooded stream banks, but it does like moist soil, and it has been spotted along the Lake Huron shoreline. I've actually seen some growing on the shoreline at the Bayfield main beach in the past few years. And the seeds can remain dormant and regerminate in the soil. So even after it's been removed, it can come back within the next couple of years. And it can really form really dense monocultures, almost choking out all the native vegetation on the forest floor. So all those beautiful ephemeral flowers that you see in the spring, it takes over their habitat so they can't grow. It uses their light, their water, and it's also a threat to butterflies. It's actually toxic to butterflies, unfortunately. But what's kind of neat about this plant is that it is edible. So that's probably how it ended up here in Ontario. It might have been brought over as a garden ornamental plant. I've actually seen it in a couple of people's gardens before. But if you are out removing garlic mustard, you can actually do something with the plants afterwards. You can find recipes online. You can make garlic mustard pesto, which I know sounds a little weird, but I have tried it and it's actually really good. Or you can actually pick the smaller leaves off and use those as an addition in salads. So the smaller leaves tend to be less bitter than the larger leaves, and yeah, it has kind of a garlicky flavor to it, which is kind of neat. So if you want to remove this plant though, which I highly recommend, the best way to remove it is by hand pulling. It's actually really easy to remove. You just grab it close down to the roots and give it a tug, and it usually comes out quite easily. The best time to do this is in the springtime, so April and May, before the plants have gone to seed. And yeah, you can also mow it or cut it or clip the flower heads, but really hand pulling the entire plant and making sure the root is removed is the best method. And in some terrible, really extreme cases, chemicals have been used as well to try to remove it. And this is done either in the early spring or the late fall when the other plants are more dormant. And so once you've started to remove some of these plants, it's really important to try to put in native plants to replace them. So if you want to choose some nice ground cover type plants that will help to prevent the regrowth of the garlic mustard. So you can plant things like bearberry, for example, which is a lovely ground cover. And overplanting with native plants will help to outcompete that garlic mustard. So you want to try to do that in the early spring. That's best. Our next plant is spotted knapweed. So this plant comes from Eastern Europe, and we actually have 5 different invasive knapweed species in Ontario. We have spotted knapweed, black knapweed, brown knapweed, diffuse knapweed, and Russian knapweed. But spotted knapweed is probably the worst one on the Lake Huron shoreline because it is a really highly competitive weed, and it invades disturbed areas, and it really degrades our native plant communities, including our sand dune habitats. So we've seen a lot of these in our Lake Huron sand dunes, unfortunately. And it quickly outcompetes our native species. This is a familiar theme. A lot of our invasive species do this. And it just turns to near monocultures in some areas that we've seen. So to remove it, it's pretty similar to garlic mustard. You can pull it or dig it, but it's a lot harder to remove. It's a lot more difficult to get out of the soil. And it does tend to come back quite quickly. So you have to keep at it for, probably a couple of years at least, if not up to 5 years maybe, to keep it from coming back permanently. And you can also, if you don't have time to go out and fully remove the plant, you can cut it, you can mow it once a year when it's in its early flowering stage. So this won't stop that plant from coming back, but it might help to prevent further spread of it. So it will stop it from flowering and seeding. Burning is not recommended for this plant because the seeds are actually protected by tough fire-resistant kind of covers on those seeds, so it doesn't react well to burning. And again, chemical treatment should only be really used as a last resort for a really massive infestation and should only be done with training. Giant hogweed, this one has been in the media quite a bit lately. And so this plant comes from Southwest Asia, and it's a garden ornamental actually. But it's a perennial plant, and it's actually a member of the carrot family. But the scary thing about it is that it has a clear watery sap that contains toxins that can cause severe dermatitis or inflammation of the skin. So if you get this sap on your skin, you can actually get really severe burns if the site of contact is exposed to the sun. So it reacts to the sunlight and you get these terrible burns and blisters. And it can happen up to 48 hours later after contact, and it can cause severe scarring that can last for many years afterwards. And some reports have even said that if the sap comes in contact with your eyes, it can actually cause temporary or permanent blindness as well. So we really recommend do not touch this plant if you see it. I have seen it around the Lake Huron shoreline in the Bayfield area and up in Bruce County as well. So don't touch this plant. And so removal is very tricky. So we recommend that if you do see giant hogweed, that you first contact your municipality or your county to find out if they can help, because I know several do have programs that can help remove these more dangerous invasive species. But if not, if you do have giant hogweed on your property, it's probably best to hire a professional to remove it because they have the equipment, and hopefully they won't, the spread will be reduced, so you won't have as many seeds spreading, and also they're trained, so hopefully there will be less injuries this way. And as with most invasive species, reducing a large population of giant hogweed, it's going to take a long time. It's going to be a long-term commitment. But the best time to remove it is late April, early May. And so it's usually a lot smaller at this point and easier to dig up. And it's more susceptible to herbicides at this time of year. But yeah, protective clothing is absolutely essential. And it can't be burned, and it shouldn't be composted after being removed. So if you are removing it, again, like with Phragmites, you want to put it in black, thick plastic bags and seal those really tightly and put them in direct sunlight for at least 5 days to let the sunlight, the heat, kill the plant. So you want to let it dry out really thoroughly before disposing of it. And it's probably best to contact your local municipality to find out if they can take giant hogweed or other invasives at their local landfill sites. So zebra mussels, these come from Eurasia as well, and they're freshwater bivalves, and they're native to actually the Black Sea region. And I think a lot of people have probably seen these in Lake Huron. I know I've seen them while out snorkeling. And they're capable of heavily colonizing hard and soft surfaces. So they've been seen on docks, on boats, breakwalls, and even on beaches. And they've also been found to clog intake structures in power stations and water treatment plants. So they've caused a lot of problems for us humans. And they can also impact our aquatic ecosystems in a lot of different ways. Probably the greatest impact from them comes from their filter feeding activity. So they're filter feeders, and they filter feed large quantities of plankton. And since there are so many of them, they reproduce so quickly they're producing, a female can produce 1 million eggs per year. So since they're reproducing so quickly and eating so much, they can actually reduce the amount of food available, the amount of plankton available for fish and other aquatic species. And the other issue with them feeding on these phytoplankton is that it actually clears the water. So that might sound like a good thing at first, it's making the water more clear. But if you think about it, if the water is more clear, this actually allows the sunlight to penetrate deeper into the water column. And this forces our more light sensitive fish like walleye into deeper and darker waters. So it impacts those fish. And this increased light penetration also encourages the growth of aquatic vegetation. So you might have thick water, aquatic plants growing out into deeper areas that they're not usually found. And this can also cause increasing occurrences of algae, of algal blooms in the Great Lakes, which then impacts our fish, our wildlife, and us people. And since these zebra mussels are filter feeders, they're filtering water, they're also accumulating any suspended contaminants that are in the water, and they're accumulating those in their bodies. So scientists are concerned now that the health of fish and birds that are eating these zebra mussels will then be negatively impacted by these contaminants that are in their bodies. So they really throw the entire ecosystem off kilter. And quagga mussels are another invasive mussel species. They're pretty similar to a zebra mussel, but they're a little bit larger. And these have been spotted in the southern Great Lakes as well. And both of these species were believed to have been introduced probably in around the 1980s by ballast water from transoceanic ships. And so they could have been carrying in their ballast water juveniles or even adult mussels, but most likely they were carrying larvae that couldn't even be seen. So you can help with this with reducing zebra mussels and quagga mussels by, first of all, if you do have a boat, by inspecting your boat and trailer and your equipment on a regular basis. So anytime you're coming out of the water, make sure you're removing any plants and animals and mud that you're finding and disposing of them. And if you are draining water, to make sure you drain water from your boat on land and not in a water body. And if you're fishing, to make sure not to release any live bait. So the best thing to do is to empty your bait bucket on dry land, or you can freeze or salt the bait for later use. And it's important to remember that it is illegal to release live bait fish from one water body into another, and that is to help prevent the spread of invasive species. And so sometimes there'll be things on your boat or your equipment that you can't see. So the best thing to do with that is to rinse off all of your equipment with hot water if you can, or using a pressure washer that helps to remove them. Drying your equipment out in the sun for a few days. And if you have any really hard to clean equipment like fishing nets, you can submerge those in hot water, so over 40 degrees Celsius for about 10 minutes, and that will help kill off any invasive species as well. So the next invasive species is the round goby. So this is a small bottom-dwelling invasive fish, and it's native to the Black and Caspian Seas area in Eastern Europe. And we first spotted it in North America in 1990. This was in the St. Clair River, just north of Windsor, Ontario. And like the invasive mussels we just talked about, researchers believe that this fish was brought to North America in the ballast water of ships. And in less than a decade, the round goby spread successfully to all 5 of our Great Lakes, and it's already begun to invade inland waters as well, so it's spread very quickly. And in some areas, the round goby, their population has reached densities of more than 100 fish per square meter, so that's a lot. And the goby tends to prefer waters that have really rocky and sandy bottoms. That's where I've spotted them. And they tend to feed really aggressively on insects and other small organisms that are found along the lake and river bottoms. But it's kind of interesting that they actually eat large quantities of zebra and quagga mussels. So they are helping to reduce the zebra mussel population, which is very interesting. But their aggressive eating habits and their ability to reproduce several times each season has helped them to multiply really quickly, and they compete with and prey on our native bottom-dwelling fish. So those could be the mottled sculpin and the log perch, so they're predating them. And they also threaten a few species at risk in our Great Lakes Basin, so the northern mad tom and the eastern sand darter, and some of our native freshwater mussels are being impacted by the round goby. And they've actually reduced populations of our sport fish because they tend to feed on their eggs and their young as well, and they're out competing them for food sources, of course. And scientists have actually found that the round goby can be linked to outbreaks of type E botulism in Great Lakes fish and birds that are eating those fish. So this disease is caused by a toxin that might be passed. It's thought to be passed from the zebra mussels to the goby, then to birds. So we're getting large die-offs of fish and birds because of this invasive species. So you can help by, first of all, learning how to identify the round goby. And so there are a couple of our native species of fish that you could mix it up with. So our sculpin, for example. So you want to make sure that you're identifying them correctly, and then making sure that you're never buying or using round goby as a bait. So it is against the law to use round goby as bait or to have round goby in your possession. And of course, it's important to remember as well just to never put any live fish into Ontario lakes, rivers, or streams. Asian carp. This is an interesting one. It's been in the media a lot lately. So Asian carp have, they come from Asia, and they came to North America in the 1960s, but they've begun to migrate north through US waterways, including the Mississippi, and they've been migrating towards the Great Lakes over several decades. We have 4 different species of Asian carp that are now regulated in Ontario. So these are 4 species that we're concerned about. That's the silver carp, the big head carp, the grass carp, and the black carp. And they could be mixed up with the common carp that are already established in the Great Lakes. And Asian carp are such an issue because they consume up to 40% of their body weight every single day. So they eat a lot of vegetation very quickly. And they also grow very quickly. An Asian carp can grow more than 25 centimeters, so almost a foot in their first year. And they can actually end up weighing up to 40 kilograms, so like over 80 pounds, and they reproduce very quickly. And silver carp are actually a hazard for boaters. I don't know if any of you have seen any videos on YouTube of these fish jumping out of the water, but it's quite the spectacle, so I would recommend you check it out. But basically, the vibration of boat propellers can cause these silver carp to jump out of the water, and they can jump up to 3 meters or almost 10 feet high. And people have actually been seriously injured by these fish because they're jumping so high so quickly, and there's so many of them in some areas. So these Asian carp, they're considered one of the greatest threats to the Great Lakes right now. So we're working very hard to keep them out of the Great Lakes. Now, according to Fisheries and Oceans Canada, no silver carp or black carp had been found yet in the Great Lakes, at this time anyways. And to date, there have been a few rare captures of individual bighead carp and grass carp in the Canadian waters of the Great Lakes. But so far, only 3 bighead carp have been found, and that's all been in western Lake Erie. And these are thought to have been intentionally released. Then with grass carp, there have been 23 captures since 2012 of grass carp in the waters or the tributaries of Lake Ontario, Lake Huron, and Lake Erie. So only 23 in all 3 lakes. And they tested those, and only 9 of them were found to be fertile. And there's no evidence of breeding populations at this time of grass carp, so that's a good thing. But it's not good that we're finding them. But it is likely, it's thought by Fisheries and Oceans Canada that these fish that were caught were likely escapees from areas where populations might have been used trying to control aquatic plants, or they could have again been intentionally released. So it's good to know that they're not breeding at this time in Lake Huron anyways, but it's definitely something we want to keep an eye on and keep these carp out of our lakes, because they'll have a major impact if they do end up breeding in Lake Huron. So enough about Asian carp. I have another fun fact. Manitoba maple is actually another invasive species. It's an invasive maple species. It does come from Manitoba, but it's invasive in Ontario. And so it has a compound leaf. Its leaf looks quite a bit different from the sugar maple and red maple that we're used to here. And the reason it's invasive is it does have a really extensive root system and a deep taproot, which makes it really difficult to remove. And it doesn't have as many natural native controls here as it does in Manitoba. And so it starts to shade out ground cover, and it starts to displace our native plants. And yeah, it is difficult to remove. So the best method, if you do see these, is to hand pull or remove these seedlings with a trowel, and trying to get all those roots, of course. And then you should be disposing of any branches or small saplings to prevent the spread of seeds. And you can actually use these for maple syrup though, and if you are removing it from your property, you can use the wood for decorative projects like wood turning. Our next plant is water milfoil. So this one came from Europe, Asia, and Northern Africa, and we first spotted it in Lake Erie back in 1961. And it's thought that this one is probably from the aquarium trade. So it might be from the ballast water ships, it's hard to say, but very likely from the aquarium trade. And so it grows in more shallow waters, so you might see it in a coastal wetland. So it usually likes to root in areas that are a bit less than 10 feet in depth. And it grows very quickly, it's a perennial, and it forms really dense underwater mats that shade out other aquatic plants that do belong there. But the problem with these dense underwater mats is when they start to die off in the fall, those plants decay, and that can actually reduce the oxygen levels in the water. So really dense populations of water milfoil have been found to actually cause fish and other aquatic species die-offs. So fish are living in this area and there's not enough oxygen for them, so they're killed in massive numbers. And so this plant is interesting because we do have a native milfoil, and this Eurasian water milfoil can breed with our native species and then it forms a more aggressive form of invasive species. And this plant spreads very easily. It can spread through just a tiny little piece. So it's easily spread when, say, a boat goes through an area. It might chop it up a little bit and then spread the fragments. And it can also be spread by trailers, fishing gear, carrying this plant to new areas, to new lakes. And these thick mats of water milfoil also impact us, not just the fish, but they're impacting us because it makes it more difficult for boating and fishing and swimming in these areas where it's really taken over. So the best thing you can do with Eurasian water milfoil is to try to avoid spreading it. So making sure that, yeah, you're cleaning all your equipment. Again, make sure you're cleaning your boat, your trailer, your fishing equipment. And if you do have an aquarium or a water garden at your home or on your property, to make sure that you're not using this invasive species or another invasive species like it. So it's really important as an aquarium hobbyist to make sure that you're only using native plants. So you're encouraged, if you are purchasing plants, to do a little research and make sure you're asking for plants that aren't invasive, because unfortunately some people do end up dumping their aquariums, and that's how some invasive species enter some of our beautiful lakes. We also have the rusty crayfish in Ontario. So this is a large crayfish, and it's very aggressive. It has really aggressive eating habits, and it rapidly spreads, having serious impacts on our native crayfish populations. So these rusty crayfish compete with our native crayfish for food and resources, and they're actually found to be better able to avoid predators than our native crayfish. So we're really seeing that areas where rusty crayfish are moving in, that our native crayfish are declining in numbers. And these rusty crayfish feed so aggressively that they eat a large quantity of aquatic vegetation, and they can actually change spawning and nursery habitat for a native fish species. And it's kind of interesting that some species at risk in Ontario, like the queen snake, they're only able to feed on our native crayfish population. So rusty crayfish are causing not only the decline of our native crayfish, but other animals that depend on them to survive. And we also have another fun fact. A lot of people don't think of a goldfish as being an invasive species, but some people decide when they've had enough of their pet that they should dump them into our lakes. And unfortunately, goldfish grow very large out into the wild, and very similar to other invasive fish species, they're out competing our native fish and starting to take over. So really important. Never release live goldfish, never release any wild pet or live pets out into the wild. It's there has to be a better way to rehome these animals. So how are invasive species spreading? Well, we've talked about this a little bit, but again, these invasive species are spreading by wind. They're moving through water. Water is carrying seeds, or even animals can be picking up invasive species seeds and transferring them to other places. But a lot of the times, it's human action that's causing the spread of these invasive species. So it could be through the horticultural trade. There are actually, unfortunately, a lot of nurseries out there that are still selling a lot of invasive species. So just because you're buying a plant from a nursery doesn't mean that it's a safe species to be planting. So you always want to make sure you're doing your research and not purchasing any invasive species, and trying to use native species wherever possible when you're gardening. And I've mentioned that your boats, trailers, ATVs, even your hiking boots and construction equipment can carry invasive species into an area. So that's why we really don't recommend having ATVs in our coastal ecosystem. So not riding them through coastal wetlands and across beaches. And yeah, as we've changed the land use in some of our natural areas, there's been more disturbance. So a lot of these species really thrive on disturbance. So when you tear out a lot of our native species, that's when these invasives have a chance to take over. And I think that's probably why we're seeing a lot more of things like Phragmites along our transportation corridors. So those are disturbed areas. We have a lot of vehicles moving through, and it's really easy for those seeds to spread in those types of areas. And for similar reasons, we're also seeing them in agricultural drainage ditches. So if native vegetation is removed, it makes it very easy for invasive vegetation to grow. So that's really important to remember. So we want to keep our native vegetation where it belongs, wherever possible. So our amazing Coast Watchers volunteers, I hope there are some of you out there tonight, so you're a big part of protecting our lake by monitoring for change. And so watching, being our eyes and ears of the coast, and including watching for the presence of invasive species. Invasive species are really expensive, as I mentioned, to remove once they're established. So prevention and action once you're first observing these is really important. So if we know about them, we can do something about them more quickly. And so all of you can help, whether you're a coast watcher or not. If you do find an invasive species in the wild, you can help by contacting the invading species hotlines. There's actually a phone number you can call if you see an invasive species or if you think you have, and they can help you to identify it as well and to figure that out. And the other thing you can do is go onto something called EdMaps. So That stands for Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. It's a bit of a mouthful, but they have the website there, and they actually have an app for your smartphone that you can use, and you can report sightings of invasive species, and it helps to build this province-wide map of all the invasives. So that helps people to know where they are so that something can be done about it. So if you do find an invasive species, it's recommended that you take some photos and try to note down any identifying features. So also noting down the date that you found it, and trying to note down the exact location that you found the species as well. So if you can get GPS coordinates for where you are, that's really helpful as well for people like us who want to go out and remove them. And of course, don't return the invasive species to the water. And yeah, just learning more about these invasive species. I didn't have time to go into a lot of detail. There's so many that we could talk about tonight. But hopefully this has piqued your interest and you want to do a little bit more research into this. And you can do that on our website, so lakehuron.ca. And there's also a great website on invasive species called invadingspecies.com. And they have information on pretty much every invasive species in Ontario, so they're a really great resource. And other things you can do if you're really motivated to try to help with this issue, you can join. There's a lot of different community groups you can get involved with. So there's the Lambton Shores Phragmites community group. There's the Kincardine Residents Against Frag. There's the Ipperwash Frag Fighters, Brucedale Residents Association, and of course, if you're not a Coast Watcher already, you can join our program next year and help us to monitor the coast next year. And you can fill out an application for that on our website at lakehuron.ca/careers. And that's pretty much everything I have to say tonight. So thank you very much for listening and participating in this webinar. And unfortunately, we don't really have too much time for questions now, but if you do have questions on anything I've talked about tonight, or you just want to chat some more, you can always send us an email at coastalcenter@lakehuron.ca, or you can call the office. The number's on the screen there. And like I said, there's a lot more information on our website. And we do have social media pages that you can follow as well to learn more about our Lake Huron coastal ecosystems and some of the events we have coming up. And we also do have a monthly e-newsletter that you can sign up for on the homepage of our website. So thanks again to our sponsors, Bruce Power and RBC, for making tonight happen. And thank you again to all of you for attending. Hope you enjoyed it. Good night.